Discussions about the morality of mass bombings during World War II focus on the use of atomic bombs, yet most Americans are not familiar with the firebombings that killed even more civilians, to include thousands in China. Large formations of American bombers would drop hundreds of incendiaries, firebombs, over a city to cause large fires. These overwhelmed local firefighters and grew until they joined and created a massive firestorm, like a forest fire, that was too intense to extinguish. These spread quickly, killing thousands of trapped civilians, even those in bomb shelters. In the Pacific, long-range American B-29 bombers based in the Marianas Islands burned up nearly all Japanese cities. The largest firebombing was on the night of March 9, 1945, when 334 B-29 bombers attacked the most heavily populated civilian sectors of Tokyo. In that one night, over 100,000 people were burned to death after a heavy bombardment of incendiary bombs. Those deaths are equivalent to the wartime number of American casualties in the entire Pacific Theater. Another 1 million Japanese who escaped were left homeless. After all the industrial targets in Japan were destroyed, activities were hidden and dispersed in cities, and bomber pilots had no more legitimate targets. Bombers and their crews required lots of manpower and resources that the Army and Navy wanted, so generals needed something to bomb, and cities were the only option. As a result, in the 9-month-long B-29 civilian bombing campaign, over 400,000 Japanese civilians died. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed just 120,000 people. The morality of these mass bombings is open for debate. American General Curtis Lemay was an enthusiastic advocate of firebombing. Some Americans instantly dismissed these civilian deaths as collateral damage. This was not the case because civilians were usually the primary target. In the great documentary Fog of War, an officer who planned these attacks, Robert McNamara, stated that they were acting as war criminals and said General Lemay told him so. A great clip from Fog of War is linked below. As McNamara noted, killing German and Japanese did save American lives. Civilians helped in the war effort, and some would fight if their hometown was invaded. The Japanese were expected to defend Japan street by street, and 1 million American casualties were expected. What is never discussed was the American mass bombings of Japanese-occupied Chinese cities during World War II. The Chinese were our allies, who had been overrun by the Japanese. Historians and governments ignore these massacres because they are inexplicable. American B-29s were based in China to strike targets in Japan. Their bases were threatened by Japanese advances on the ground, so they often bombed Japanese targets in China. U.S. Major General Claire Chennault played a major role in the firebombing of the Chinese city of Wuhan. It was the largest city in central China with over 1 million residents that served as a major Japanese supply hub. Targets around Wuhan had been bombed several times, but Chennault wanted to wipe out the entire city. As commander of the 14th Air Force based in southwest China, his air bases were threatened by Japanese advances. According to his memoirs, Way of the Fighter, Chennault described difficulties getting the necessary backing for his firebombing proposal. He blamed General Joseph Stilwell, the senior U.S. commander in the China theater, for refusing to destroy Chinese cities. Only after Stilwell was pulled out of China did Chennault get approval from his replacement, Lieutenant General Albert Wedemeyer. On December 18, 1944, 94 B-29 bombers took off from airfields outside Chengdu on an operation codenamed Matterhorn. They dropped 500 tons of high explosives and 500 tons of incendiary bombs on Wuhan. Visibility was so poor that many bombs landed outside the city. Nearly 20,000 Chinese civilians were killed and an equal number seriously wounded. The city burned for 3 days and survivors were left homeless. Japan invaded and annexed the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan, in 1895 when China ceded its claim after losing the First Sino-Japanese War. The island was inhabited by Han Chinese and various indigenous people living in the mountains. Japan built military bases and factories to support its empire. As the U.S. Army fought to recapture the Philippines in 1945, Army generals considered an invasion of Formosa. However, that large island is mountainous with only 3 small landing beaches. The Joint Chiefs wisely decided to bypass Formosa and invade smaller Okinawa instead, to provide the main base for the invasion of mainland Japan. By 1945, Japanese ships were no longer based on Formosa, as they had all been sunk or withdrew to Japan. Nearly all of Japan's aircraft on Formosa were destroyed in an October 1944 battle with the fleet of 14 U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. Tactical airstrikes caused heavy damage to airfields, docks, and oil tankers. The stranded Japanese on Formosa were no threat to American forces, but bombing continued. By 1945, American bomber groups ran out of good targets on Formosa. According to the official history of the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, link below, quote, "So many of the significant targets on Formosa were situated in the island cities and towns that area bombing was frequently employed. The resulting destruction, it was assumed, not only would reach supplies of military importance and many small industrial units, but would impose upon the enemy, through destruction of housing and municipal services, a serious loss of labor." Unquote. This means cities and towns were targeted for destruction because Chinese provided labor to the Japanese Empire. The bombings were designed to kill Chinese civilians and destroy their homes. Many examples are mentioned, including the destruction of Tainan, Formosa's largest and oldest city with over 1 million residents. The Army official history notes, quote, "On 1 March, 44 B-24 Liberators dropped 387 500-pound incendiaries squarely on Tainan, which on 12 and 13 March was to receive a total of 84 1,000-pounders. On 20 March, a formation of 34 B-24s finished the job with a load of 260-pound frags, 100-pound napalms, and 100-pound incendiaries, burning out the military barracks and housing area in the northern half of the city. Tainan was hit occasionally as targets of opportunity thereafter, but it no longer offered targets for mass raids." Unquote. Thousands of civilians perished, although no official number was ever published, as this history was repressed when Taiwan became an American dependent ally after the war. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Army and Marines were nearly finished securing the island of Okinawa. Formosa had been bypassed. It was isolated and a threat to no one. Unlike the B-29s, the older B-24s lacked the range to hit mainland Japan. Their bomber generals still wanted targets, big targets that would make the news. The second biggest city on Formosa was Taihoku, now known as Taipei, with 1 million residents. It had been bombed numerous times and all military and industrial targets destroyed. Nevertheless, on May 31, 1945, 117 B-24 bombers from the 5th U.S. Air Force conducted the largest Formosa bombing ever on this defenseless city. The bombing began at 10 o'clock in the morning and lasted until 1 in the afternoon as formations dropped 3,800 bombs on the city center. Government offices were hit and the Railway Hotel, main library, Imperial University, main rail station, the Bank of Taiwan, Taihoku High Court, Taihoku Park, Taihoku First Girls High School, Hashan Catholic Church, and the famous Lushan Temple of Manaka. At least 3,000 civilians were killed and many more seriously wounded, more than all other attacks on the city during the war combined. This great finale was the last major bombing attack on Formosa and accomplished nothing but death and destruction in the city.